Welcome to Planet Poet Words in Space. I'm your host, Sharon Israel, and it's my pleasure to introduce award-winning poet Christopher Brean Murray, whose debut collection, Black Observatory, published by Milkweed Editions, was selected by Dana Levin as the winner of the 2021-22 Jake Adam York Prize. Also joining us later in the show is Planet Poet's Poet-at-Large, Pamela Monche Pierce. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Sharon. Nice
I'm so happy you're here.
Glad to be here.
Chris, I'm going to read your bio for our listeners. Christopher Brean Murray has received awards from the Academy of American Poets and Inprint Houston, and he served as online poetry editor of Gulf Coast. His poems have appeared in American Poetry Review, Colorado Review, Copper Nickel, New Ohio Review, Washington Square Review, and other journals. He lives in Houston, Texas. And Chris, this is a totally compelling and absorbing collection. I really enjoyed reading it.
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. And would you start us off with a poem?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Well, I'll start by reading the first poem in the book, which is called A Welsh Scythe, as in the country of Wales and the farming implement. A Welsh scythe is better than a Swiss lathe or a Scotch spade. I wouldn't think of using a Norwegian adze or an Austrian sledge unless it was clear that a Welsh scythe was not available. Once I employed a Belgian T-square, which was enlightening, though the results were less than impressive. The Greek panel saw loaned to me by a neighbor was hardly worth my time, but in his garage I spotted a Slovenian radius trowel, and that helped me in ways I could not have predicted. Avoid Polish jackhammers and Finnish gimlets. These items are not only dangerous, they're addictive and rude. The French chisel is a charming device. If the Welsh scythe did not exist, this tool would be worth considering. But it does exist. Therefore, I advise you to fling the French chisel into the Seine next chance you get. Yesterday, a man was bludgeoned with a Serbian mallet, but that is not so surprising. A famous sonnet was once written about the Portuguese linoleum knife. Still, the poet was third-rate, and he hanged himself with the garter of his former mistress. Spanish forceps. I acknowledge their originality and verve. They could easily seduce a naive journeyman. I, however, remain unconvinced by the Italian whipsaw, the Hungarian bench plane, the Danish spike bit, and the Russian boilermaker's hammer. In the 17th century, a brief skirmish was fought over the Swedish putty knife, but that is, at best, a footnote in a forgotten history book glazed with dust in a blind machinist's basement. Much more significant was the appearance of the Bulgarian plowshare. Few now recall the scandal prompted by this apparatus, but I assure you, in its day, it was radical. As for the English, what have they given us but the grease gun? And so I, an Irishman, straddle this lonely heath, gripping my grub axe, dreaming of a scythe from Wales.
That's Christopher Brean Murray reading A Welsh Scythe. Apart from everything else, it's a very funny poem to open the collection with.
Thank you. Which is part of why I think I put it there.
So funny. And it's, how did the poem come about, Chris? How did you think of the poem?
Well, at the time that I was writing most of the poems in this book, I was kind of in the habit or mode of a lot of times starting with titles. And I would come across them in funny places. I would just either, it would be in something I read or something I overheard, and a little phrase would strike me as that could be a title. And so one day I just had this phrase for some reason I either don't remember or I don't know. A Welsh scythe popped in my head, and I thought, that seems like a title, but I have no idea what the poem would be. And essentially, what I think happened is I have this reference book that I've had for a long time called The Word Meant New. I think it was put out by Random House or something like that a long time ago. And it has all these lists in it. And it has lists of countries, and it has lists of farm implements or different tools or something like that. And I think I just fairly, I think I just looked up those and then went, oh, okay, I could combine some of these, see what happens. And then this character who's speaking in the poem came to life in some way, and you know, he seems to be pretty serious about himself, and
Right, right.
thus I mean, I think that's maybe part of where the humor comes from is how scholarly or something he seems to approach a fairly odd topic, but
But the voice and the diction, they're so delicious. They're so resonant and full of rhythm and loveliness. So I like that sort of juxtaposition of those things in the poem. And you started telling us why you started the collection with this poem. Could you tell us
well,
more?
I mean, one thing is I've read this poem at readings, and it was, even as I just read it now, it was a little funny because it was quiet, where of my poems, this one has gotten often a bit of a reaction. And so, but I think part of it is also, as the title of the book indicates, Black Observatory, there's some dark material in this book, but I think it's often treated playfully.
Right.
Uh, and maybe I wanted this poem to signal to the reader that it's not all grim going ahead. And maybe sometimes what you start with will color what comes after. And so the hope is that people will understand that there's play throughout the book.
Right. Yeah, that's a great reason to start the collection with this poem. And it's like a tour of Europe through its implements. It's very educational.
I mean, it could, I don't know whether it's dictated largely by the lists I was looking at. I will say that my reading in poetry, certainly besides reading in American and sort of British poetry, involved a lot of reading poetry in translation. And I wouldn't say at all that it's exclusive to Europe, because I certainly have enjoyed a lot of, let's say, South American poets or poets from other places. But I will say there's a lot of European poetry that has kind of meant a lot to me. And I mean, there was one anthology I encountered at a kind of crucial time that was edited by Charles Simic and Mark Strand, called Another Republic. That is I don't know if I remember the number of poets in it, but it might be 17 European and South American poets, and it's where I encountered poets like Paul Celan and Fernando Pessoa and Henri Michaud, and so I think there is a little bit of this European fascination I have.
Chris, would you introduce us to, I think, a very important poem in the collection, The Haunted Coppice, if I'm
Yes, absolutely.
pronouncing that correctly?
The Haunted Coppice. At the end of the dead-end lane, clogged with burr-shagged tangles and pricker-studded stems, within earshot of the trickling rivulet that probes the margins of the warehouse district, one encounters the inauguration of a path. At first, it's just a strip of moss between rotting logs infested with termites. Then a discernible track of packed dirt snakes through fern growth under rioting constellations of gnats. Finally, a clear trail appears and hugs the rim of a culvert. It meanders indecisively through larch shade before diving underground and emerging in a chirping thicket. I strolled that track many times in my youth, slicing at skunk leaves with a switch, inventing with my comrades frightening myths that peopled the coppice with oracles and outcasts. One tale followed the exploits of a deceased soldier who wandered the forest in search of his misplaced sidearm. When my friends and I found a petrified boot amidst thistle, we recalled that somnambulant grunt. A neighbor's spaniel would accompany us, sniffing the trail, scurrying forward before pivoting to make sure we followed. Didn't that trail lead to the Black Observatory that hummed like a power station beside a secret landing strip? Didn't an estuary appear through foliage, its cobalt waters cleaved by a white yacht's hull? Colin, in his brogue, claimed the yacht transported papyrus scrolls scribbled with esoteric maxims. I said the crew passed a chalice infused with the blood of a sacrificed saint. We argued until dusk. Then we got lost. Only the shining arc lamps saved us. At table with my parents, I sipped from my chalice, my hair smelling of ferns.
That's Christopher Brean Murray reading his poem, The Haunted Coppice. And Chris, a coppice, I was reading, is an area of woodland in which the trees or shrubs are cut back to ground level to stimulate growth and provide firewood. So that's like a path, a man-made path, which in your hands becomes this fairy tale scary place.
Well, I think in a way, it's possible that I misused the word coppice a little bit in the sense that I probably meant more just the woods. But I liked the sound of that phrase, the haunted coppice, so much. I mean, just because you can see in the poem, you get into pretty deep, dark woods there. But it's interesting because as I was anticipating talking about this poem, I had mentally some sort of connection with Thomas Hardy's poem, The Darkling Thrush. I just thought of in relation to this poem, and I was like, why am I thinking of that poem? And I thought maybe it was because some of my language in the poem with the sort of meticulous detail connects to, and then when I went back and was revisiting it the other day, I noticed that in the first stanza of that poem, you encounter both the word haunted and coppice. And I think I may have gotten the idea a little bit for the phrase from that poem. But I'm not saying beyond that I know exactly what the connection is. But
I think it's a perfect choice.
yeah.
Even the way it has a different intention. It was created for one reason, and it has a totally different intention in your poem. Michael Wicks of West Trade Review talked about the Black Observatory, which makes its first appearance in this collection, I believe. And he says that the poem explores the dream states needed to glimpse the Black Observatory. And it's a very dream-like poem. Would you tell us what you think the Black Observatory is, Chris?
Right, as the title of the book. Well, I'll just say first that this image of the Black Observatory popped up in a few poems I was writing, kind of to my surprise. And I think this was probably the first one where it did. And then there's another poem you encounter later in the book that has that in it. And then at some point you encounter the poem titled Black Observatory. What I'll say is I don't want to say what it is.
Mm-hmm.
The truth is I'm not sure I know precisely what it is. And that probably says something about the way I write poems, which is I'm not sure I want to know exactly. Or even if I said what I think it is, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's what it is, because
That's true.
readers are going to decide for themselves
Mm-hmm.
what they think it is. But I will say that the context in which you encounter it in this poem,
Mm-hmm.
it's in a question. Didn't that trail lead to the Black Observatory that hummed like a power station beside a secret landing strip? It suggests that there's some kind of power humming associated with this mysterious Black Observatory. The Black Observatory also being kind of the opposite of what an observatory. I think of the Griffith Observatory or something being white, right? Just
Mm-hmm.
there is some kind of reversal, but the other part being it's beside a secret landing strip. So does that one that makes it potentially secret, but what are the associations with the secret landing strip? Contraband or some sort of covert activity? Is that poetry? I don't
Oh, you don't
know.
know. For me,
But
the Black Observatory has always been there before anybody else was there.
I can live with that. I guess what I'll say is that's just like this is a poem in a way about wandering into the woods and into these imagined adventures. Is the somnambulant grunt the reality to that? Is that just imagined? And even if it's just imagined, is it just imagined, or is it, that the imagination can take on a certain reality of its own, which is, I think, happens kind of also at the ending of the poem, where the speaker is sipping from a chalice while sitting at the dinner table.
Yes, there's two
Um,
chalices in that poem. It's the Black Observatory to me also. It's very in its primal quality. It's very Jungian. It's like you discovered it. It's not you saw it. So it was always there. You discovered it with your
I mean, that resonates with me because that's a big part of the way I try to approach poetry, which is discovery. That I if it's going well, I'm being surprised by what's coming up, and that I don't. It's not stuff I planned. It's not stuff I could conceive ahead of time. The act of writing the poem is a kind of, at its best, it reveals stuff to me that I go, oh, really? That's what I came up with, or that's
yes.
what I'm
It's,
thinking, or something.
the path. The coppice. The path is also a path leading to whatever the reader is being encompassed by. Chris, could you tell us why this book is in four? You structured the book in four sections.
I don't know if I know the answer to that
Okay.
precisely. I guess what I can tell you is, um, so in years ago, I arrived in Houston to begin a PhD in creative writing and literature, and the first semester I was here, I was taking a workshop with Kevin Proofer, and he said to me, "Do you have a manuscript?" And I said yes, and he said, "I'd like to see it." And so I sort of slid this manuscript towards him, and he read it, and he said, "This is great, but the first thing you need to do is cut it in half." It was just it was like 100-page long
Ah,
manuscript. There was a long poem in there that was like 10 or 15 pages, and he was just like, "You need to shrink this down." And so that's when I really started. I mean, because that was just sort of this mass collection of the best of sort of the work I had been coming up with. And I had a close engagement with him of figuring out how do I shape this into the most effective manuscript. And part of it was making it as readable as possible. And part of it was to not do too much of the same thing. I didn't want I didn't want it to be dull at any point.
no, it's
So I
not
think the
dull.
sections make it this manageable kind of read. It's not a super long book. It's fairly concise. I've tried to put some variety in there. And another thing is the poem, the book, and I think we're going to get to a poem fairly soon that is an example of this. But there are a lot of poems about characters. Book, some often named in the title, and I tried to space them out throughout so that you would encounter one every so often and not all the time.
The imagery really anchors the reader. It's very accessible and it's very mysterious at the same time, which I think is the best, makes poetry great, whatever that means. But I know you have narrative. You use a lot of narrative in the poems and create characters. I just wanted to read a review in Publishers Weekly, which says, I'm just taking an excerpt. Murray's poems defy convention propelling down the page with generous narrative energy, spinning stories about characters, Winston, Knut, and Segovia, with the detail-oriented eye of a novelist. Other poems offer a graceful lyric description, and I think it does all of that. What I like about this too, it says, in one, Murray questions, had he forgotten what age he was living in? Aptly speaking for poems that exist in and out of time, critical of the world they inhabit, yet focusing on sublimity that goes beyond the current moment. I like that. I think
Mhm.
it says a lot about what you're writing. And would you read one of those poems that was
Absolutely.
mentioned?
I'm going to read this poem called Get Segovia.
Great.
And I'll preface it by saying there's one curse word in this poem that I'm going to disguise a little bit. You'll know it when it comes. Get Segovia. If you're going to hire a guitarist, get Segovia. Not Andres, the other younger Segovia. He's not related. He's hated by purists for his irreverent solos. He wears bolo ties and snakeskin boots. His fingers shoot down the neck at lightning speed. He pursues the essence of a Bach minuet with a sort of artistic greed. Half of him doesn't give an F. The other half needs to chase the sublime like a hound pursuing a fox into a thicket shattered by moonlight. Once I heard him turn Schubert into a blues using a penlight for a slide. A couple rose and left the theater in a huff. Others expressed gruff criticisms in the lobby. I enjoyed the piece, though I had front row seats and Segovia was gassy. It was a small price to pay. Another time, he plucked a raucous César Franck. Somehow, though he played an acoustic, feedback flowed from the rear of the auditorium. When the piece ended, his fingers tripping playfully down a staircase of notes, I demanded more of him, not because he'd let me down, but because I was drunk and couldn't face the blank page of sobriety. He suffered from notoriety. At first, he enjoyed it, but then it affected his playing. His fugues lacked staying power. His arpeggios were uninspired. He was mired in the crowd's expectations. He tried playing loudly, matching the notes with his nicotine-frayed voice. That was a bad choice, but at least he was searching. Once in the middle of a Brahms, I saw his hand lurching uncontrollably up and down the neck. He collapsed, his guitar in splinters. The audience cheered. Flashbulbs strobed their oblivion. Had he forgotten what age he was living in? He got wise, lay low, and practiced. Soon he was back on tour, playing smaller venues. His menu was the same: Paganini, Grieg, and Schumann. And still, he dressed like a blues man. He's got the fire, and I recommend him without reservation.
That's great. That's Christopher Brean Murray reading his poem "Get Segovia." I love the hand lurching over the over the arm of the guitar. It's filled with humor and exuberance. And Chris, you were saying before that you were a musician before you were a poet.
That's true. I grew up kind of obsessed with rock music, a big Beatles fan, when I was a little kid and was in my first rock band when I was 10 years old. So I grew up steeped in rock music and yet at a certain point when I went off to college, the college I went to, Lawrence University in Wisconsin, half the school's a music conservatory, and so I have these memories of like first couple weeks of school, strolling the halls of my dormitory, looking at my fellow students' CD collections, and it's like Beethoven and Mozart, and I'm going, there's not a rock CD to be. I mean, occasionally somebody would have the White Album, but otherwise it was like wall to wall classical and jazz, and it was like disorienting to me. Um, and then I became a DJ at the classical radio. You could be a DJ as a student, but only for classical music. And I tried to do whatever I could to sort of work around it. But all I can say is somehow the collision of the low
Yes.
culture of rock and roll is intersecting in this poem with the sort of high culture of classical music. But I also think for me, as somebody who started out playing rock music and then became a poet, there was also this kind of, how do you reconcile that I'm this huge AC/DC fan, but I'm also reading Wallace Stevens or John Keats or something. And so I think that this poem, in a playful way, by creating this character, is trying to sort through it.
Yes.
Yeah.
The character embodies this conflict, if you will, but
Yeah.
you have to carry them both at the same time, which is weird. You're listening to Planet Poet Words in Space on WIOX Community Radio. I'm your host, Sharon Israel, here with Jake Adam York Prize winner, poet Christopher Brean Murray. Now joining us by phone from Manhattan to bring us the latest poetry news and poetry insights is Planet Poet's Poet at Large, poet and visual artist Pamela Monche Pierce. Pamela is delighted to have two collages in the current issue of Paris Lit Up in Paris, France. Hello, Pamela.
Hello, Sharon. Hello, Christopher. I'm enjoying this so much. I always enjoy being an audience member. And Christopher, your work is so gorgeous. I want to end today in my own work with trying to get deeper into this space of haunting and mystery, because you've inspired me to go there. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's a wonderful show today. I also want to thank you, Christopher, for having this beautiful book, which is the inspiration for what I'm going to do today. Not only the contents, but it's the cover. I opened the Amazon bag and I saw the back of the cover and I went, oh, because it's black. And because I love black so much, and I'm always intrigued by painters and artists who use the color black. I immediately wanted to find out. I went to the inside cover and I found out that this beautiful background with this nature study in it was by Otto van Schreek. And born in 1613, died in 1678, part of that wonderful golden age of Dutch art. And I kept reading about him. And in addition to that, he spent time in Italy. And he is also considered the inventor of sottobosco, which means under the woods, which was a big movement, and he was at the vanguard of that. So it's just an exciting cover in his work. His dark studies, we're talking a lot about darkness and haunting and mystery today. His dark studies of plants in the underbrush with lizards and insects and all sorts of crawlies. And I can always smell it when I keep reading about him, and I can smell this decay and the richness of the soil. So black is something that I'm always drawn to. I love black. I love black as a color. And then there's the great debate, is black a color? And that's a big debate about among artists. And, the thing is that, if you look at a rainbow, black isn't on the visible spectrum of color. So, and all other colors are the reflections of light except black. So black is considered the absence of light. Mm-hmm. But the poet that I'm going to read from today, Lorna Goodson, really makes a case against that in a very, very interesting way. I'm going to go right to her poem.
Great.
One of the wonderful things about Google is I went to Google and I Googled poems about the color black. And one of the things that popped up was this poet, Lorna Goodison, I think is how she pronounced it. And she wrote a poem called To Make Various Sorts of Black. Now, Lorna Goodison is a contemporary of mine. She's exactly my age, which is mid-70s, and she is the poet laureate of Jamaica. She started as a visual artist, and she studied not only in Jamaica, but at the Art Students League, where I have been studying for many years. So I felt a real kindred spirit. I felt, yay, like school spirit. She went to the same place. And she studied there with Jacob Lawrence, who is still considered the most important African-American painter of the 20th century. And she was his student for many years at the Art Students League. In a PBS interview, she read the poem that I'm going to read, and she said, one day the painting stopped coming, and I was just writing all the time. When I'm on the show, I talk about the place where poetry is influenced by other arts, or poets are making other kinds of art, or some connection between the two. And she was inspired by the Craftsman Handbook by Cennino d'Andrea Cennini, which was written in, I think, 1447. So that's the name of the poem. And she talks in these different stanzas about different materials that you can use and different methods of making the color black. She goes farther down toward the midpoint of the poem, and this is how the poem goes. A lamp you light and place underneath, not a bushel, but a good, clean, everyday dish that is fit for baking. Now bring the little flame of the lamp up to the undersurface of the earthenware dish. Say a distance of 2 or 3 fingers away. And the smoke that emits from the small flame will struggle up to strike at clay. Strike till it crowds and collects in a mess or a mass. Now wait a while, please, before you sweep this color, now sable velvet soot, off onto any old paper, or consign it to shadows, outlines, and backgrounds. Observe, it does not need to be worked up or ground. It is just perfect as it is. Refill the lamp, Cennini says, as many times as the flame burns low. Refill it. I think it's a lovely
great.
poem. It's a wonderful poem. And it's a wonderful, I always love, as we all do, what is the thing that is going to inspire us to write a poem? And in this case, her artist part was reading this formula for creating a certain kind of paint. And what Goodison is always trying to come to is that the source of that black is light, so that the soot is the product of the flame. It's not that it's not the other way around. So I think she's a keeper, and
Yeah.
I think one of the other things that I found out about these Caribbean poets are usually, or oftentimes, painters as well. And so that in the Caribbean, there is this connection between the two of them, which is something that I'm always pursuing, not only in my own life, but in my segments on the show. This I think is very important and vital connection, and that they create the cover artwork for their books, which is something that I really, really want to know more about. And I aspire to, for my next poetry book, I would like to do my own cover. And that leads me to a question for you, Chris. Did you have anything to do with the fantastic selection of this artwork for this book?
Not directly, in the sense that I wasn't the one who found this painting. And let me just interrupt to say, if I'm not mistaken, and I don't think I am, when I was getting my MFA at University of Michigan, Lorna Goodison was a professor there. I don't know if she's still
Wow.
Yeah, but what I was going to say is, one influence I may have had is just that I was asked, what do you want in a cover of the book, or what do you have in mind? And so
Right.
I sort of explored some things that I thought about what it might be, but then I sort of deferred to the people at Milkweed Editions to figure this out, and they sent me options, and it was very interesting because this was not my first choice, even though it was in the PDF they sent me. The first 2 choices that I made I was told we can't get the rights to those.
Oh,
And
same old story.
there was another painting by the same painter that painted this cover, but there was much more light and much prettier in a way. But then at a certain point, it wasn't initially, but then I sort of went, wait a second, and looked at this one. And now it just seems amazing to me that I didn't choose it immediately, because I mean, there's literally a poem in the book that features a lizard in a forest. And so it almost, is surprising how well it fits, but I love the cover.
It does. And our listeners, too bad our listeners can't see it, but you can go to my website when the podcast comes on in a couple of weeks, SharonIsraelPoet.com, and you'll be able to see it.
So you have to buy the book.
Right.
Pamela Moshe Pierce, Poet at Large. Thank you so much for a wonderful segment.
It's wonderful to be on the show. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. And Christopher, we're going to continue with an incredible poem. I know it's not very original to say, but I love this poem. It's called The White Sands Motel. And it is a little longer read, but everybody just sit back and listen.
It's a poem in parts, so I will read the numbers of each part. The White Sands Motel. 1. Here there's no rainy season. Sun scalds my forehead, yet the pool is empty. Beside it, a toppled table, its glass surface shattered. The asphalt is too hot for bare feet. 2. Far away, white hillocks and white dunes under a deep blue sky. Swirling winds rake grooves into the dunes. A glass of wine in one hand, I lower my binoculars. 3. An old man sweeps sand from the motel's lobby. Still, sand is everywhere. In my blazer's pockets, under the glass of that photograph, on my plate of tangerine sections. 4. What do I see through binoculars? The charred remnants of a campfire, a vermilion lizard skittering across a dune, a putrefaction on the sand resembling a man. I sip my wine. 5. The brochure says a continental breakfast served each morning. So I rise, shower, shave, and tuck a handkerchief into my breast pocket. In the lobby, a dish of mints and a cup of coffee. 6. The neon sign reads, no vacancy, in a violet looping cursive. So where are all the guests? Today, a boy in sunglasses knocked on my door. He tried to sell me soap from the housekeeper's cart. 7. No carpet covers the floor of my room. The mattress is excessively firm. No lamp. At night, my room is dark. Sometimes, however, the moon shines through the sand-scratched glass of the skylight. 8. Last night, I dreamt that a man was traversing a desert with a glass crutch. A fox followed him, occasionally trying to steal it. Angry, the man struck the fox, shattering the crutch. 9. I couldn't get back to sleep. A neighbor came me up. I heard something like a jar of pennies being poured again and again into a brass chalice. I lay in bed, staring into the dark. 10. The conference was canceled. I could barely understand the message, so poor is my phone's reception. I punched the glass over the fire alarm. I stitched my knuckle with black thread. 11. How long have I been here? Why was I sent without colleagues? Is there a town nearby with a nightlife? Where are all the women? How many pairs of glasses could be made with all this sand? 12. Today, a new president will be inaugurated. You would never know it by sitting in the lobby. the lugubrious concierge stares at the TV, but the TV is off, reflected in the glass, miles of white sand.
That's Christopher Brean Murray reading his poem, The White Sands Motel. It's extraordinary because it's told solely in images, and each image is very, very precise and evocative. Would you talk about how he used imagery, if you can, in the poem?
Well, one thing that's interesting is after what Pamela said about the color black, this poem had, when I sort of gave myself the assignment to write this poem, it had these different elements to balance, and two of those were black and white. And I think that came from the fact that it was the White Sands Motel. And I think in an initial draft of the poem, those colors were said more explicitly, whereas now when they're not, the colors are in there, but even if the names of the colors aren't said. But I would also say the other elements are glass and sand.
Yes, I was going to say that glass crutch is
Yes.
an unusual image.
And the wine glass and
Yes.
throughout. But as far as the imagery goes, I mean, I would say that imagery was one of the first things that anchored me into poetry. One of the things that first drew me to poetry was, encountering the imagery. And when I first really got into writing poetry, a lot of times my poems were extremely image driven. I think maybe they are less so than they were, but nevertheless, I think it's part of what makes. And it might sound funny that to say, speaking of something that's imagined, to say to make it real, but it's what makes you have, for me, a very convincing, world that you're creating in a poem is to ground it in a very visceral, physical way. So imagery is really important for that reason.
It's a real, I'm sorry, a real emotional reality. Emotional.
Well, and it makes me think also of I want to say, and it's been a little while since I studied this, but I want to say the original sort of, even probably as articulated by Ezra Pound, thoughts of the imagist poets of the early modernism era was that the image was this complex that it wasn't just an image, but it was a place where sort of emotion and deeper things could take on power in a way in a poem, and that it's not, at its best, imagery is more than just a picture. It can be imbued with all kinds of things.
Right. I just want to briefly say that Christopher, Pamela, and myself, we take Jeffrey Nutter's seminar, Walson Glass seminar. He's very big on imagery, and I'll just leave it there. And I'm trying to put more of that emotional imagery, whatever that means, in my poems. And you've done it. You were completely successful. And I don't want to reduce your poems to imagery, but you know what I mean. I also found it very cinematic, and I've seen a while ago Antonioni's The Passenger, and it evoked that kind of atmosphere.
Absolutely. I mean, I love movies, and that's a movie not only I've seen, but I think I definitely saw that movie before writing this poem, and that movie also very much struck me. There's a real loneliness and strange, mood of that film, and it's somehow also related to identity and the sort of dissolution of identity by detachment from, I don't know, all expected approaches to the world or something. But it's also got Jack Nicholson, which
Yes, of course.
I'm usually game if that's the case.
Speaking of disembodied entities, you've written a poem called The History of Clouds. Would you read that, Christopher?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
A History of Clouds. You can think while walking, running, washing the dishes, reading, grocery shopping, or sleeping. Driving across Nevada at night breeds thoughts. They leap from sagebrush like jackrabbits into your high beams. Most people can't think while writing. They have ideas, yes, but not thoughts. Anyone can snatch an old idea out of the dust and show it around. Trying to think will invariably prohibit thought. I thought of writing this poem while driving to work this morning. I made sure not to think about it much. The wind swayed a stoplight until it turned green. A man in a tank top leaned into the window of a parked car. It was not yet 8 a.m. Wisps of cloud coursed through the sky over Houston. Someone should compile a book called A History of Clouds. It could be, among other things, an anthology of descriptions of clouds from novels, from the love letters of exiled princes. Shakespeare's pestilent congregation of vapors speech would appear, as would Mayakovsky's The Cloud in Trousers. Clouds aren't mentioned much in the Bible. God did, however, call to Moses from inside a cloud. Enoch speaks of the locked reservoirs from which the winds are distributed. Cranes to the cloud juggler and Stephen's sea surface full of clouds, and that passage from Gogol where a cloud slithers over Nevsky Prospect. It stretches and coils and becomes an intestine, embracing the anxious protagonist until we realize he's being suffocated by his thoughts. Somewhere Rilke speaks of vast, ruined kingdoms of cloud. That from the love letter of another exiled prince.
Ah, it's a gorgeous poem. That's Christopher Brean Murray reading A History of Clouds, and it floats like a cloud. It meanders like a cloud. It's sort of like an anti-Wordsworth poem. I'm just it's a wonderful poem, Chris. And
Doesn't wander lonely as.
I don't know. So I guess thinking inhibits creativity in a way. It does, right? I mean, is that what you were saying in the poem?
I think the sense, well, it made me remember that when I was an undergraduate in one of the first poetry workshops I took, I wrote this poem called Why I Write. And it ended with a line that says, I think it said something, I mean, it's very undergraduate sounding, but I think I said, I want to drown the world in poison ink. And then it ended by saying, I want to write so I don't have to think. And I remember that my professor at the time said, I hope this isn't true, Chris. This is disturbing to me. I hope this isn't true. And it's funny to think that even then I thought of it in those terms, but I guess what I mean I guess I meant it in that poem, but certainly in this one is a certain kind of thinking, which is a thinking that is a kind of cerebral, like the brain divorced from the rest of the body. And I feel like when a poem is really cooking, when it's really happening, it's all, I think of it as being a wholeness of one's being, which includes the brain, but it's not exclusive to the brain.
I really like that.
And it's very common in other walks of life to say you need to get out of your head, whether it's an actor on stage or it's an athlete on the field or something. Like, don't overthink it. I mean, I was thinking about this question last night, and I was thinking I'm a big Roger Federer fan, tennis, and you go watch clips of him playing, and or any other tennis player, but like that you'll get yourself into a pickle where you have to invent a shot you never practiced to return the ball. They don't stop to think about it. But they've put the thinking in ahead of time and all the practice and all that stuff, and then they have to rely on their instinct or their intuition in the moment. And I feel like that's how I approach poetry, which is yes, of course there's a kind of thinking, but it's not a cerebral scheming. Right. It's a trusting of the intuition in a way.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Would you, speaking of wholeness and emotion, would you read Duke and Pam for us, please?
Absolutely. Duke and Pam. One thing I've never been able to get into a poem is the way I felt about my dogs. I was a kid and woke first on Saturday, came downstairs and slid the glass door open to speak their names into the blue, the barn uphill to the left, the pines silent all around, a hint of oncoming snow. Within minutes, Duke and Pam would trot from the woods, my bare hands and feet chilled. I'd say, "Come on." They'd enter and climb onto the torn couch, rear to rear, and I would get on top of them, wedge my feet between cold fur and squeaking leather, lie down, my cheek to fur, and talk to them, listen to their grunting pleasure as they licked and licked my hands.
That's Duke and Pam, like Christopher Brean Murray. Could you just tell us a little bit about that poem and how it's different and similar to the collection, the rest of the collection?
Well, this was actually came out of an assignment my professor at the time, the late Tony Hoagland, gave to me in graduate school, and he said, begin a poem with the line, "One thing I've never been able to get into a poem," and so it automatically kind of steered me towards something that's maybe a little different than what I often do. And I would say this is probably a poem that's a little closer to straight autobiography than a lot of the more fictionalized poems in the book. In that I did grow up having dogs named Duke and Pam, but it felt like an important poem in the collection because, in a way, because of that, I think, because it's the tone I think is a little different.
Yeah.
And
it's so poignant. It's a real love poem. It's wonderful. Chris, if our listeners want to hear more about Black Observatory and a little bit more about you, what do you suggest? Where do you suggest they go?
Well, one place is to the Milkweed Editions website where you can read a little about the book and you can see maybe some of the comments of reviews of the book. You can also purchase the book there. I've got some other poems online, or in some cases, earlier drafts of poems in this book, and new stuff. There's a video on YouTube of me reading one of the poems from this book. So I've got a little bit of an online presence.
Great.
Yes. Milkweed Editions website.
Okay. It's all on there. Chris, I want to thank you so much for your work, which I found very transforming and extraordinary. Thank you very much for being on the show, Christopher Brean Murray.
Thank you to Pamela, and thank you very much, Sharon. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're welcome. And thank you to our poet at large, Pamela Marche Pierce. And thank you all for listening.